Welcome to A Year of War and Peace. I'm your host, Brian E. Denton. A Year of War and Peace is a daily, year-long, chapter-by-chapter reading of and meditation on Leo Tolstoy's epic novel, War and Peace. In these videos and podcasts, you'll be treated to a free reading of one chapter per day of the novel, plus a reflective essay I've written individually tailored to that day's chapter. These readings are offered for free, though if you'd like to support me, you can do so in one of three ways. First, you could purchase my ebook, A Year of War and Peace. It features the entire novel, plus all of my reflective essays, and it's only $2.99 on Amazon.com. You could also become a patron at patreon.com/Brian E. Denton. If you sign up there, you'll receive a sonnet once a month, plus a link to an ebook of my collected sonnets. Finally, if you like, you can make a one-time donation to my PayPal account. The email there is brianedenton@gmail.com. You can also use that email to contact me. I'd be happy to hear from you. Your support is greatly appreciated. Today we will be reading Chapter 40 of War and Peace, followed by a reflection on the same. Chapter 40. Between 3 and 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Prince Andrew, who had persisted in his request to Kutuzov, arrived at Grunt and reported himself to Bagration. Bonaparte's adjutant had not yet reached Murat's detachment, and the battle had not yet begun. In Bagration's detachment, no one knew anything of the general position of affairs. They talked of peace, but did not believe in its possibility. Others talked of a battle, but also disbelieved in the nearness of an engagement. Bagration, knowing Bolkonsky to be a favorite and trusted adjutant, received him with distinction and special marks of favor, explaining to him that there would probably be an engagement that day or the next, and giving him full liberty to remain with him during the battle or to join the rear guard and have an eye on the order of retreat, which is also very important. However, there will hardly be an engagement today, said Bagration, as if to reassure Prince Andrew. If he is one of those ordinary little staff dandies sent to earn a medal, he can get his reward just as one in the rear guard. But if he wishes to stay with me, let him. He'll be of use here if he's a brave officer, thought Bagration. Prince Andrew, without replying, asked the prince's permission to ride round the position to see the disposition of the forces, so as to know his bearing should he be sent to execute an order. The officer on duty, a handsome, elegantly dressed man with a diamond ring on his forefinger, who was fond of speaking French, though he spoke it poorly, offered to conduct Prince Andrew. On all sides they saw rain-soaked officers with dejected faces, who seemed to be seeking something, and soldiers dragging doors, benches, and fencing from the village. "There now, Prince, we can't stop those fellows," said the staff officer, pointing to the soldiers. "The officers don't keep them in hand. And there," he pointed out to the sutler's tent, "they crowd in and sit. This morning I turned them all out, and now look, it's full again. I must go there, Prince, and scare them a bit. It won't take but a moment." "Yes, let's go in, and I will get myself a roll and some cheese," said Prince Andrew, who had not yet had time to eat anything. "Why didn't you mention it, Prince? I would have offered you something." They dismounted and entered the tent. Several officers, with flushed and weary faces, were sitting at the table eating and drinking. "Now what does this mean, gentlemen?" said the staff officer, in the reproachful tone of a man who has repeated the same thing more than once. "You know it won't do to leave your post like this. The prince gave orders that no one should leave his post. Now you, captain," and he turned to a thin, dirty little artillery officer who, without his boots, he had given them to the canteen keeper to dry, and only his stockings, rose when they entered, smiling not altogether comfortably. "Well, aren't you ashamed of yourself, Captain Tushin?" he continued. "One would think that as an artillery officer you would set a good example, yet here you are, without your boots. The alarm will be sounded, and you'll be in a pretty position without your boots." The staff officer smiled. "Kindly return to your post, gentlemen, all of you, all," he added in a tone of command. Prince Andrew smiled involuntarily as he looked at the artillery officer Tushin, who, silent and smiling, shifting from one stocking foot to the other, glanced inquiringly with his large, intelligent, kindly eyes from Prince Andrew to the staff officer. "The soldiers say it feels a bit easier without boots," said Captain Tushin, smiling shyly in his uncomfortable position, evidently wishing to adopt a jocular tone. But before he had finished, he felt that his jest was unacceptable and had not come off. He grew confused. "Kindly return to your post," said the officer, trying to preserve his gravity. Prince Andrew glanced again at the artillery officer's small figure. There was something peculiar about it, almost unsoldierly, rather comic, but extremely attractive. The staff officer and Prince Andrew mounted their horses and rode on. Having ridden beyond the village, continually meeting and overtaking soldiers and officers of various regiments, they saw on their left some entrenchments being thrown up, the freshly dug clay of which showed up red. Several battalions of soldiers, in their shirt sleeves, despite the cold wind, swarmed in these earthworks like a host of white ants. Spadefuls of red clay were continually being thrown up from behind the bank by unseemly hands. Prince Andrew and the officer rode up, looked at the entrenchment, and went on again. Just behind it they came upon some dozens of soldiers, continually replaced by others, who ran from the entrenchment. They had to hold their noses and put their horses to a trot to escape the poisoned atmosphere of these latrines. They rode up the opposite hill. From there the French could already be seen. Prince Andrew stopped and began examining the position. "That's our battery," said the staff officer, indicating the highest point. "It's in charge of the queer fellow we saw with his boots. You can see everything from there. Let's go there, Prince." "Thank you very much. I will go on alone," said Prince Andrew, wishing to rid himself of the staff officer's company. "Please don't trouble yourself any further." The staff officer remained behind, and Prince Andrew rode on alone. The farther forward and nearer the enemy he went, the more orderly and cheerful were the troops. The greatest disorder and depression had been in the baggage train he had passed that morning on the road to Znaim, road 7 miles away from the front. At Grunth also some apprehension and alarm could be felt, but the nearer Prince Andrew came to the French lines, the more confident was the appearance of our troops. The soldiers in their greatcoats were ranged in lines. The sergeants major and the company officers were counting the men, poking the last man in each section in the ribs and telling him to hold his hand up. Soldiers scattered over the whole place while dragging logs and brushwood and were building shelters with merry chatter and laughter. Around the fire sat others, dressed and undressed, drying their shirts and legs bands and mending boots or overcoats and crowding around the boilers and porridge cookers. In one company dinner was ready, and the soldiers were gazing eagerly at the steaming boiler, waiting till the sample which the quartermaster sergeant was carrying in a wooden bowl to an officer who sat on a log before his shelter had been tasted. Another company, a lucky one for not all the companies had vodka, crowded around a pock-marked, broad-shouldered sergeant major who, tilting a keg, filled one after another the canteen lids held out to him. The soldiers lifted the canteen lids to their lips with reverential faces, emptied them, rolling the vodka in their mouths, and walked away from the sergeant major with brightened expressions, licking their lips and wiping them on the sleeves of their greatcoats. All their faces were as serene as if all that were happening at home awaited peaceful encampment, and not within sight of the enemy before an action in which at least half of them would be left on the field. After passing a chasseur regiment, and in the lines of the Kiev Grenadiers, fine fellows busy with similar peaceful affairs, near the shelter of the regimental commander, higher than and different from the others, Prince Andrew came out in front of a platoon of grenadiers, before whom lay a naked man. 2 soldiers held him, while 2 others were flourishing their switches and striking him regularly on his bare back. The man shrieked unnaturally. A stout major was pacing up and down the line, and regardless of the screams, kept repeating, "It's a shame for a soldier to steal. A soldier must be honest, honorable, and brave. But if he robs his fellows, there is no honor in him. He's a scoundrel. Go on, go on." So the swishing sound of the strokes and the desperate but unnatural screams continued. Go on," said the major. A young officer with a bewildered and pained expression on his face stepped away from the man and looked round inquiringly at the adjutant as he rode by. Prince Andrew, having reached the front line, rode along with it. Our front line and that of the enemy were far apart on the right and left flanks, but in the center there were men with the flag of truce had passed that morning. The lines were so near together that the men could see one another's faces and speak to one another. Besides the soldiers who formed the picket line on either side, there were many curious onlookers who, jesting and laughing, stared at their strange foreign enemies. Since early morning, despite an injunction not to approach the picket line, the officers had been unable to keep sightseers away. The soldiers forming the picket line, like showmen exhibiting a curiosity, no longer looked at the French but paid attention to the sightseers and grew wary waiting to be relieved. Prince Andrew halted to have a look at the French. Look there," one soldier was saying to another, pointing to a Russian musketeer, who had gone up the picket line with an officer and was rapidly, excitingly talking to the French grenadier. "Hark to him jabbering. Fine, isn't it? It's all the French you can do to keep up with him. There now, Sidorov." "Wait a bit and listen. It's fine," answered Sidorov, who was considered an adept at French. The soldier to whom the laughers referred was Dólokhov. Prince Andrew recognized him and stopped to listen to what he was saying. Dólokhov had come from the left flank where the regiment was stationed with his captain. "Now then, go on," incited the officer, bending forward and trying not to lose a word of the speech which was incomprehensible to him. "More, please, more. What's he saying?" Dólokhov did not answer the captain. He had been drawn into a hot dispute with the French grenadier. They were naturally talking about the campaign. The Frenchman, confusing the Austrians with the Russians, was trying to prove that the Russians had surrendered and had all fled away from Ulm, while Dólokhov maintained that the Russians had not surrendered, but had beaten the French. "What have orders to drive you off here? And we shall drive you off," said Dólokhov. "Only take care you and your Cossacks are not captured," said the French grenadier. The French onlookers and listeners laughed. "Well, we'll make you dance as we did under Suvorov," said Dólokhov. "What's he singing?" asked the Frenchman. It's ancient history," said another, guessing that it referred to a former war. "The Emperor will teach you Suvorov as he taught the others." "Bonaparte," began Dólokhov, but the Frenchman interrupted him. "Not Bonaparte. He is the Emperor. Sacré nom!" cried he angrily. "The devil skin your Emperor." And Dólokhov swore at him in a coarse soldier's Russian, and shouldering his musket walked away. "Let us go, Ivan Lukitch," he said to the captain. "Ah, that's the way to talk to the French," said the picket soldiers. "Now, Sidorov, you have a try." Sidorov, turning to the French, winked, and began to jabber meaningless sounds very fast. He said, trying to give an expressive intonation to his voice. They all laughed at him. They came in peals of such healthy and good-natured laughter from the soldiers that it infected the French involuntarily, so much so that the only thing left to do seemed to be to unload the muskets, explode the ammunition, and all return home as quickly as possible. But the guns remained loaded. The loopholes in the blockhouses and entrenchment looked out just as menacingly, and the unlimbered cannon confronted one another as before. All right, that concludes my reading of Chapter 40. We will now be reading the reflection on Chapter 40. A Year of War and Peace, Day 40. They talked of peace. Prince Andrew's wish is granted. After a persistent pestering, Kutuzov approves his request to join Bagration at the front. Upon his arrival at the front, Prince Andrew insists on inspecting the troops. This is one of the reasons why Prince Andrew has always been one of my favorite characters. He acts with intelligence and purpose and with a meticulous attention to detail. This makes it so it's hard to catch him out. His goal in inspecting the position, for example, is to get a grasp of the situation, so if he's asked to execute an order, he knows exactly what to do and where to go. Bagration charges an officer to give Prince Andrew a tour of the front. At first, Prince Andrew notes that the troops are a bit disorderly. Some have even abandoned their post in favor of shelter from the elements inside a tent. But as Prince Andrew and the officer approach the front lines, passing by the shit stink of the latrines, things become more serious. The farther forward and nearer the enemy he went, Tolstoy writes, the more orderly and cheerful were the troops. The greatest disorder and depression had been in the baggage train he had passed that morning on the Znaim road, 7 miles away from the French. At Grunth, with some apprehension and alarm could be felt, but the nearer Prince Andrew came to the French lines, the more confident was the appearance of our troops. Gone is the disorganization of the rear guard, replaced by the seriousness of the front. I love this passage. It's kind of like the aging process, in that the closer we approach death, the more, pun intended, grave we become. At any rate, Prince Andrew finally reaches the very front of the front line. At this point, he notes, the French are so close that he can make out their faces. They are so close, in fact, that the Russians and the French are able to speak to one another. Our old friend Dólokhov is there, actually, and being that he's able to speak the French language, he is tasked with launching insults at the enemy. Today, let's take a rare break from referencing the philosophers and conclude with one of the great passages from the novel itself. It appears early in the chapter as Prince Andrew surveys the troops at the front, and it just might be the saddest, yet most accurate line written in the entire book. Daily Meditation. They talked of peace, but did not believe in its possibility. Leo Tolstoy, War and Peace. All right, so on that depressing note, we conclude our reading and reflection on Chapter 40 of War and Peace. Thanks for listening. Remember that if you'd like to support me, you can do so either by purchasing the ebook, A Year of War and Peace, becoming a patron at patreon.com, or making a one-time donation at PayPal. The links to all that are below. Tomorrow we will be reading and reflecting on Chapter 41 of War and Peace. I hope you'll join me then. Until then, take care of yourselves and of others.